The combine was bleeding oil. Not a drip, not a leak. A bleed, dark and slow, spreading across the cracked hardpan of a Cass County, Illinois field on a Tuesday morning in September of 1983, the kind of morning where the sky is the color of old pewter and the corn is so tall and so dry it hisses when the wind moves through it. Harlan Boak stood underneath that machine, a 1968 John Deere 95 high-low, serial number 95H21904, a combine that most men had given up on a decade before, and he pressed two fingers against the hydraulic line like a battlefield medic checking a pulse. The harvest was 3 days away. The line had split. And somewhere down the road, in the air-conditioned showroom of Grimley Farm Equipment in Braidwood, Illinois, a man named Dale Grimley was already composing the phone call in his head. The one where he told Harlan Boak that it was finally over, that the land Harlan's grandfather had broken with a horse and plow in 1911 was going to belong to someone else by Christmas. But Dale Grimley didn't know something. He didn't know about the Boneyard. Let me tell you about Cass County, Illinois in the autumn of 1983. This is flat country, anciency bottom flat. The kind of flat that makes a man feel both vast and very small at the same time, where you can watch a thunderstorm build from 40 miles away, column by column, anvil by anvil, like God setting furniture. The corn in late September stands 8-9 feet tall. You lose a child in it, you lose yourself in it, and when it dries down toward harvest, the fields crackle and whisper with a sound like 1,000 playing cards being shuffled all at once. The air smells of diesel and dust and something sweet and slightly rotten underneath, the smell of corn silk drying, of husks beginning to give. It is one of the most particular smells in American agriculture, and any person who grew up in that part of the country will tell you without hesitation that it smells like money, or it smells like the threat of losing money, depending on the year. 1983 was a bad year. The farm crisis that would devastate the American Midwest through the mid-1980s had been building for nearly a decade. Land prices that had skyrocketed through the 1970s were in freefall. Interest rates that had peaked at 21% in 1981 were still punishing anyone who carried debt, and in farming, everyone carries debt. The USDA's Economic Research Service would later calculate that between 1981 and 1987, net farm income in Illinois dropped by nearly 40%. Farms were failing. Men who had worked the same ground as their fathers and their fathers' fathers were signing papers at courthouses and walking away from everything they knew how to do. The pressure that autumn sat on every farmer in Cass County like a hand pressing down on the chest. And right at the center of that pressure, on 480 acres of prime but heavily mortgaged ground along a gravel road called County Line 2050N, was a man named Harlan Boak. Let me tell you about Harlan Boak. He was 51 years old in 1983. Medium height, wide through the shoulders from 40 years of physical work, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same hardwood as an old plow handle. He had a mechanic's fingernails, permanently darkened in the creases no matter how long he scrubbed, and a farmer's squint, etched permanently into the corners of his eyes from a lifetime of reading weather and light. He'd graduated from Beardstown High School in 1950, gone 2 semesters at the University of Illinois on an agricultural scholarship, then come home when his father's first heart attack made it clear somebody had to run the operation. He never went back, not out of bitterness. That's just what a son did. He married Lottie Gretchen Hawes in 1955. They had 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters. By 1983, 3 of the 4 had moved to cities. His youngest son, Wayne, was still around, working the farm part-time and driving a feed truck for a co-op in Beardstown 3 days a week to supplement income. Harlan was not a flashy man. He drove a 1974 Ford F-100 with 189,000 miles on it, faded red, one of the door handles replaced with a loop of baling wire. He wore the same Carhartt jacket from October through April, and in a county full of farmers who'd been buying new John Deere equipment through the boom years, Harlan Boak was notable for what he didn't buy. What he bought over the course of 30 years was time. In parts. Behind the machine shed on the north end of his property, down a 2-track through the weeds, lay what the county gossips called Harlan's disgrace. An acre and a half of old iron, combines, cultivators, planters, corn heads, grain augers, hydraulic cylinders, sprockets, chains, roller bearings, clutch plates, fan belts, electrical harnesses, engine blocks, some dating back to the 1940s. Machines that other farmers had paid him $20, $30, $50 to haul away. Salvage from farm auctions. Equipment he'd bought broken for next to nothing because he believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has never stopped paying attention, that nothing mechanical is ever truly dead. His neighbors called it junk. Harlan called it inventory. Now let me tell you about Dale Grimley. Dale Grimley was 38 years old in 1983 and had inherited Grimley farm equipment from his father, Raymond Grimley, who had built it into the largest John Deere dealership in a four-county area through hard work and genuine relationship with the farming community. Dale was not his father. Dale had an MBA from Bradley University in Peoria. He drove a 1983 Buick Riviera, silver, leather interior, the new T-top model, and he parked it in the handicapped spot in front of his own dealership because, as he told his service manager once, "I'm not walking all the way from the back lot in this weather." He wore Wrangler jeans that were never dirty and collared shirts with the dealership logo, and he smelled of a cologne called Aramis that arrived in the showroom 30 seconds before he did. Dale Grimley understood farming the way a man who has read every book about the ocean understands the sea, technically, abstractly, from a safe, dry distance. He had by 1983 begun the practice that would define his business and destroy several of his longtime customers, pushing farmers toward financing arrangements that looked generous on paper and were strangling in practice. High-interest notes on new equipment, the big green 4440 tractors, the new 6600 combines, dressed up in payment schedules that assumed land values would keep rising and corn prices would hold. They didn't. By September of 1983, Dale Grimley held partial notes on equipment owned by 11 farms in the county. 3 of those farms were already in default proceedings. And Harlan Boak, who had a $47,000 operating note through Grimley Financial Services, signed in the spring of 1981, was, by Dale's calculation, the next domino to fall. Harlan had been 2 months behind on his operating note since June. Dale had extended twice, not out of generosity but strategy. He wanted the full harvest picture before he moved. An operation that could still produce a crop was worth more than a bankrupt estate with a bad reputation attached. He had already spoken informally to a land investment group out of Champaign about a possible acquisition opportunity on County Line 2050N. He had done this in late August. Harlan Boak did not know this yet. The morning of September 13, 1983, a Tuesday, 3 days before Harlan had planned to begin cutting, Dale Grimley's silver Buick came down the gravel road trailing a rooster tail of white dust. He pulled up to the machine shed, stepped out, and walked with the careful, picking steps of a man avoiding mud, toward where Harlan was standing with his head under the 95 high-lows corn head assembly. "Harlan," Dale said, "got a minute?" Harlan straightened up slowly. "'Bout as many as you," he said. What followed was a conversation that Harlan's son Wayne, who was repairing a grain wagon 20 yards away and heard every word, would describe to his own children 30 years later, in detail precise enough to reconstruct almost verbatim. Dale Grimley had done the math. Harlan's note was $47,200. He was behind $6,100 in payments plus interest. The combine Harlan was using to cut his crop was a 1968 John Deere 95. It had been old when Reagan was governor of California. "We can work something out," Dale said, using the phrase that has preceded the end of so many farm operations that it ought to be inscribed on a monument somewhere. "But Harlan, I have to be honest with you. I cannot extend the note past the 1st of October without some kind of meaningful payment and some kind of meaningful plan." He paused. He looked at the 95 high-low, its faded green paint, its cracked side panels, the oil seeping from the hydraulic line Harlan had just discovered, and he did something that Wayne Boak would never forget. He laughed. Not a loud laugh, a quiet one, private almost, the kind that escapes from a man who is failing to conceal contempt. "Harlan," he said, "you are trying to harvest 480 acres with a 15-year-old combine that is currently leaking on your boot." Harlan looked down. He was in fact standing in a small oil slick. "I'm aware," Harlan said. "You know what a new 6600 would do for you? You'd cut this ground in half the time, half the loss, maybe save this whole situation." Dale said it with the generosity of a man offering you a lifeline attached to an anchor. "I could have one on your field by Thursday." "At what rate?" Harlan asked. Dale told him. Harlan didn't even blink. "I appreciate you coming out, Dale," he said and turned back to the machine. "Harlan," Dale's voice shifted. The warmth left it like heat leaving a stone at sundown. "I need you to understand the position you are in. I have obligations to my lenders. I have held this note in good faith for going on 3 years. If you cannot demonstrate to me a viable path to repayment starting with this harvest, then I have to consider my options." "I understand your position," Harlan said. "Do you?" Dale said. "Because that machine," he pointed at the 95 high-low with the manicured certainty of a man who is very rarely wrong about anything he considers beneath him, "is going to break down in your field. And when it does, you are not going to be able to afford to fix it, and you are not going to be able to afford to hire custom cutters in time, and I am going to be looking at a crop that didn't get harvested. And that," he straightened his collar, "is going to make my decision very easy." He got back in the Buick. He stopped before pulling away, window down. "I'll give you until the 20th. That's a week, Harlan, 7 days. The gravel dust hung in the air long after the Buick was gone. Wayne came out from behind the grain wagon. "Dad," he said. Harlan was already walking toward the boneyard. "Get your boots," he said. "Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone get told they were finished and instead of collapsing they just went to work? There is something almost frightening about that kind of stillness. It isn't the stillness of defeat, it's something older than that." Now we need to talk about what Harlan Boak actually knew. Because this is the part of the story that Dale Grimley could not have understood even if someone had explained it to him. Not because Dale was stupid, he wasn't, but because the knowledge Harlan carried was the kind that can only be accumulated by decades of paying attention to specific things in a specific place, and no MBA program has ever found a way to teach it. Harlan knew hydraulics. Not just hydraulics in general. He knew the hydraulic systems of John Deere combines produced between 1958 and 1975, with the particular intimacy that a surgeon develops for human anatomy, not from textbooks, but from being inside them repeatedly in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of harvest when everything was on the line. This knowledge had a specific origin. In 1961, when Harlan was 29, his father's combine, a 1958 John Deere 55, blew a hydraulic pump during harvest. The nearest dealer was 40 miles away and backordered on the part. Harlan spent 2 days reverse engineering the pump, rebuilding it with materials he had on hand, and getting the machine running again. The crop came in. The lesson never left him. From that point forward, Harlan operated on a philosophy that he never articulated as a philosophy. He would have called it just common sense, but which contained a practical wisdom that would have held up in any engineering school in the country. A machine you understand completely is worth more than a machine you understand partially, regardless of age or condition. He had spent 20 years accumulating a boneyard full of John Deere machines from the same engineering family, the 45, 55, 65, 95 series combines, because he understood that these machines shared core hydraulic architecture. Pump housings, cylinder bores, valve body, seal dimensions. He had documented this in his own handwriting in 3 spiral-bound notebooks he kept in the top drawer of his desk in the farmhouse. When he walked into that boneyard on September 13, 1983, he was not walking in blind. He was going to find a hydraulic line. Now, a hydraulic line on a 1968 John Deere 95 high-low is not a common part. The 95 was not produced in large numbers. By 1983, John Deere had long since discontinued support for the model. A new line, if you could even find one, would have to come from a specialty supplier, probably out of a catalog, probably in 10 to 14 days. Dale Grimley knew this. This was part of his calculation. What Dale Grimley did not know was that in the northeast corner of Harlan's boneyard, half hidden under a collapsed tin lean-to, sat the carcass of a 1966 John Deere 95 high-low that Harlan had bought for $200 from the estate sale of a retired farmer named Eldon Pratt in the spring of 1977. Harlan had bought it specifically because Eldon Pratt had kept it dry. Harlan walked to it now. He pulled back the tin sheeting. The machine was orange with rust on its exterior panels, the seat long since eaten by mice, the belt drives seized and useless. But Harlan wasn't looking at any of that. He was looking at the hydraulic harness running along the left side of the feeder house assembly. He crouched down, he pressed the line between his fingers. It was firm. "Wayne," he said, "get the cutters." It took them 4 hours. 4 hours of working in the September heat, disconnected from any news from Braidwood or Champaign, phones unanswered, lunch skipped. Wayne cutting and Harlan fitting, both of them covered in old oil that smelled like rust and time, lying in the dirt under a combine that hadn't moved in 6 years to harvest parts from it like surgeons working a donor. The line they pulled was a 36-inch hydraulic section, 3 8-inch bore with JD standard fittings on both ends. It was, miraculously, the right length. It was, miraculously, in sound condition inside. They fitted it to the 95 high-low at 4:47 in the afternoon. At 5:15, Harlan climbed into the cab, no air conditioning, cracked vinyl seat, a thermometer zip-tied to the rearview mirror that read 84 degrees, and fired the machine. The hydraulics held. He sat in the cab for a long moment, engine rumbling beneath him, and looked out at his corn. "Now I want you to think about something." Harlan Boak saved approximately $340 in parts cost that day, maybe $600 if you counted labor at a shop rate. That is not the remarkable part of this story. The remarkable part is what that $340 saved. Keep that in mind. Harlan Boak began cutting corn on September 16, 1983, at 6:22 in the morning. The dew was still on. The air smelled of wet corn silk in the first cold edge of autumn coming down from the north, and when he dropped the corn head into the first row and the stalks began to feed into the machine, the sound was a sound that is unlike any other sound on earth, a rhythmic, violent thrashing, a kind of industrial thunder that rolls across flat ground and can be heard from a mile away. His neighbor to the east, a younger farmer named Gerald Vogt, who had bought a nearly new John Deere 6600 in 1980 and was now nearly as buried in payments as Harlan was, stopped his truck on the county road to watch. He expected the old 95 to crawl. The 95 high-low was a 90-bushel-per-hour machine under good conditions. Modern combines of 1983 were doing twice that. Even generous observers would have told you that Harlan's machine, at its age and condition, would probably manage 60-65 bushels an hour and break down inside of 2 days. What Gerald Vogt and the rest of Cass County did not know, what even Harlan's son Wayne did not fully appreciate, was the third spiral-bound notebook. The one that contained 20 years of tuning notes for the 95 high-low specifically. Harlan had been running that machine for 15 years. He knew its concave clearance settings the way a musician knows fingerings, by feel, by ear, by results. He had experimented over a decade and a half with fan speeds, sieves, cylinder speeds, finding the combination that maximized throughput on his specific soil type, with his specific hybrid at his specific average moisture. He had found settings that the John Deere manual didn't suggest and that no dealer's service technician had ever tried. On dry corn in the low moisture conditions of that September, with his custom settings, the old 95 high-low was running at nearly 105 bushels an hour. Wayne was running the grain wagon alongside, and he told the story for the rest of his life. "I kept thinking the wagon must have a leak because Dad kept filling it faster than I expected, and when I'd pull out to the bin and measure, we were going faster than any number I'd heard him say before." Day 1, 3,200 bushels, 92 acres. Harlan brought the machine in at sundown, checked it over with a flashlight, replaced a worn sieve bolt he'd noted at lunch, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. Day 2 was warmer, the corn dried another 1.5 the machine ran cleaner. Gerald Vogt had called 2 other neighbors by midday. By 3 o'clock, there were 3 trucks parked on the county road watching Harlan Boak cut corn, not because they were laughing, because they weren't. Day 2, 3,410 bushels, 98 acres. The machine ran without incident. At Grimley Farm Equipment in Braidwood, Dale Grimley received a call from his service manager, a quiet man named Ken Paulson, who had grown up farming and had something of a gift for reading situations accurately. "Harlan Boak's cutting," Ken said. "I know he's cutting," Dale said. "He's cutting fast," Ken said. "That old 95, come on." "I went and looked," Ken said. "Dale, he's going to make it." There was a silence on Dale's end of the phone. "He'll break down," he said finally. "He might," Ken said, "but I wouldn't count on it." Day 3, 3,190 bushels, 87 acres. The combine developed a minor sieve rattle late in the afternoon. Harlan heard it, stopped the machine, reached into his shirt pocket where he kept, on every day of every harvest, a small collection of the bolts and clips most likely to work loose on the 95, and fixed it in 12 minutes on the side of the field. He had the bolts in his pocket because he had learned in 1974 that this exact bolt was this machine's most common failure point at this hour of a harvest day, when the heat of the afternoon caused the sieve frame to expand. He had put a reminder in his notebook. He had carried the bolts ever since. Day 4, 3,500 bushels, 101 acres. Day 5, the last 110 acres. Harlan was cutting by 6:15. By 2:30 in the afternoon, he was on the final passes of the final field, and the machine was still running, and the grain carts were full, and his son Wayne had to sit down on the running board of the grain truck for a moment because he was crying, though he would tell you if you asked that it was the corn dust. At 3:47 on September 20th, 1983, the date Dale Grimley had set as his deadline, Harlan Boak drove the 95 high-low out of the last field, folded the corn head, and drove it back to the machine shed. Total harvest, approximately 16,800 bushels over 475 harvested acres, a yield of about 35.4 bushels per acre on ground that had been hammered by a dry July, which was, given the season, respectable. Not a miracle yield, but a complete yield, a full harvest. At $3.27 per bushel, the cash price at the Beardstown Grain Elevator on September 20th, 1983, that was approximately $54,936 in gross revenue. More than enough to cover the $47,200 note at Grimley Financial Services. More than enough to cover his input costs. Enough when the accounting was done to leave Harlan Boak with approximately $4,100 in net after servicing debt and paying operating expenses, not prosperity, not comfort, but survival. One more year, the farm still his. He washed the machine. He did this every year. He pulled it to the concrete pad in front of the shed, got out the garden hose and the long brush and washed every panel of it, dried the cab with a chamois cloth. His children had made fun of this ritual when they were young. Lottie had learned not to mention it. He did it now. In the late September light, with the sun going orange in the west over the flat black fields, Harlan Boak washed a 1968 John Deere 95 high-low combine that most men would have junked in 1975, and he was alone with it and with the late light, and nobody was watching. On September 21st, 1983, Harlan Boak drove to Grimley Farm Equipment in Braidwood. He didn't call ahead. He walked into the showroom, past the gleaming 4440 tractor on the display floor, past the service counter where Ken Paulson was standing, who gave him a single nod, and he walked to the glass window of Dale Grimley's office and knocked twice. Dale looked up. He was on the phone. He held up one finger, wait, then looked at Harlan's face and said something into the receiver and hung up. Harlan came in. He set an envelope on Dale's desk. In it was a cashier's check from the Beardstown Bank and Trust, made out to Grimley Financial Services for $53,300. The full principal of the note plus all accrued interest plus, at Harlan's insistence, a prepayment on the following year's operating expenses. "I want the lien released," Harlan said, "this week." Dale Grimley looked at the check for a long time. Ken Paulson, at his counter, later said he couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see it through the glass. He said Dale Grimley's face in that moment was the face of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do and arriving at a number he didn't want to accept. Dale picked up the check, he looked at it, he set it back down. "Harlan," he said, and then he stopped. Whatever he had planned to say next, he didn't say it. He picked up the check again. "I'll have the paperwork to you by Thursday," he said. "Wednesday," Harlan said. He left. In the parking lot, walking to his faded red Ford with the baling wire door handle, Harlan Boak did not pump his fist. He did not smile at anyone. He got in, started the truck, and drove home on county roads with the windows down, and the air smelled like harvest stubble and cooling earth, and that was enough. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many things are sitting in your life right now that you've been told are worthless? Old knowledge, old relationships, old methods, old tools. What if the people calling those things worthless are simply the wrong people to be making that judgment? In the years that followed, the story of Harlan Boak and the Boneyard spread through Cass County the way farm stories spread, slowly, accurately, with details added and subtracted depending on the teller, but the core of it remaining true. Grimley Farm Equipment was sold in 1987. Dale Grimley, overextended on his own financing paper as the farm crisis deepened and defaults multiplied, sold the dealership to a regional group out of Springfield for less than his father had paid for the building. He moved to Bloomington and eventually worked in commercial real estate. The county did not discuss him much after that. Ken Paulson, the service manager, bought a small used equipment dealership in Havana, Illinois with his brother-in-law. He called Harlan Boak in 1988 to tell him about it. Harlan bought 2 rebuilt cylinder assemblies from him and drove over once a year to talk machinery until Ken retired in 2001. Harlan's son Wayne quit the feed truck job in 1985. He came back to the farm full-time. By 1988, with land prices stabilizing and some modest government program support, they had paid down the operating debt and purchased 40 additional acres from a neighboring estate, a neighbor, it must be said, who had bought a new 6600 combine on credit in 1980 and could no longer keep the payments. The Boneyard grew. Not haphazardly. Wayne had inherited his father's notebook habit, and by the early 1990s he had begun what he called the catalog, a 3-ring binder, then a computer spreadsheet, documenting every part in the boneyard by machine model, condition, and location within the yard. A thing that had looked like chaos was revealed when cataloged to be a remarkably coherent inventory. 643 distinct part numbers. 38 complete or near-complete machine carcasses. In 1991, a farmer from Mason County, 60 miles away, called because he'd heard the story, and he needed a specific hydraulic cylinder for a 1972 John Deere 45 combine. Wayne found it in the catalog, 3rd row northwest corner under the green tarp. The farmer drove 60 miles to get it, paid $85, and told 2 other farmers who called within the month. By 1995, Boak Farm Supply, which is what they began calling the Boneyard operation, though it never had a sign, was generating between $8,000 and $14,000 a year in part sales. Small money by the standards of a commercial operation. Transformative money for a farm trying to stay out of debt. Harlan Boak retired from active farming in 1997 at age 65. His heart wasn't giving him trouble yet, that would come later, but his knees were. And 45 harvests is enough for any man to say he has done his share. He signed the operational responsibility of the farm over to Wayne and Wayne's wife Carol, and he did what farmers in retirement do, which is continue to do exactly what he'd always done, just more slowly and with fewer people watching. He spent his retirement in the boneyard. He said once to his granddaughter Emma, who was 7 years old and had asked him why he didn't just throw all the old iron away and plant grass, "Emma, these machines kept a promise. You don't throw away something that kept a promise." Emma Boak is now an agricultural engineer. She works for a precision farming startup in Champaign. She has on her desk at work a 6-inch section of hydraulic line, the original one removed from the 95 high-low on September 13, 1983, the one that split and started everything. Her father Wayne saved it. He gave it to her when she graduated from the U of I in 2003. She keeps it there, she says, to remember that the difference between disaster and survival is often a part that most people would have thrown away. The 95 high-low itself ran until 1991. It was finally retired not by failure but by a cracked main frame that Wayne judged too far gone to weld safely. It is still in the boneyard, still recognizable. Still, if you know what to look for, complete enough in its mechanical anatomy to yield parts that Wayne has used twice in the last decade. Harlan Boak died in 2011 at age 78 of congestive heart failure. He died at home in the farmhouse his grandfather had built on the ground his grandfather had broken in Cass County, Illinois. The farm is still in the family. Wayne and Carol's son Daniel runs it now along with his wife. With 640 acres, they've been able to expand twice, and modern equipment that Harlan would have considered nearly science fiction. But in the machine shed, next to the current combine, a John Deere S660, GPS-guided air-conditioned, capable of 350 bushels an hour, there is still a shelf. On the shelf are 3 spiral-bound notebooks, worn soft at the corners, the handwriting inside a mixture of Harlan's and Wayne's, spanning 4 decades of observations about the specific machines on this specific ground. Daniel Boak reads them sometimes, not for nostalgia. For information. Let me tell you what this story is actually about. It's not about old tractors being better than new ones. They aren't, mostly. Modern agricultural machinery is genuinely remarkable, more capable, more efficient, more powerful than anything Harlan Boak ever operated. It's not about refusing to adapt. Harlan's family adapted. They adapted constantly. They kept their eyes open. This story is about a different kind of wisdom, a kind that gets harder to find the faster the world moves. Harlan Boak understood something that Dale Grimley did not. That deep knowledge of a specific thing, accumulated slowly and carefully over time, has a kind of resilience that no amount of capital can fully replace. The hydraulic line he found in the boneyard was not magical. It was just a piece of rubber and steel. But knowing where it was, knowing it would work, knowing it in 12 seconds rather than 12 days, that knowledge was the product of 30 years of paying attention. We live in a world that is deeply in love with newness, with the latest model, the newest method, the most recent update, and there is real value in all of that. But there is also a kind of poverty that comes from discarding things, ideas, skills, methods, tools, before we understand what they were actually worth. The boneyard is a metaphor, and I think you already know what for. How many things have you abandoned because they looked old? How many skills have you stopped developing because they seemed obsolete? How much accumulated knowledge sits in the back of your mind, gathering the equivalent of rust because something shinier came along and you stopped practicing? The farmers who failed in the 1983 crisis, and there were thousands of them, good people, hard workers, many of them failed not because they were lazy or stupid, but because they had become dependent on a system that promised to manage complexity for them. New machines that the dealer maintained, new credit that the banker structured, new methods that the extension agent prescribed. And when that system failed, when the rates went up and the prices went down and the parts weren't available, they had nothing to fall back on. Harlan had a boneyard. Not everyone can or should maintain a literal boneyard. That's not the lesson. The lesson is the posture, the habit of holding on to what you understand deeply. The refusal to accept that something is worthless simply because someone who profits from its replacement says so. The discipline to document your knowledge, to catalog what you know, to keep it accessible and usable not as a hoard, but as a resource. The boneyard logic isn't nostalgia, it's the opposite of nostalgia. It's the intensely practical recognition that resilience, real resilience, the kind that works when everything else fails, comes from depth of understanding, not newness of equipment. In the autumn of 2023, 40 years after that September morning, there was a parts shortage in agricultural equipment that made national news. Supply chain disruptions left farmers across the Midwest waiting weeks, sometimes months, for components for modern GPS-guided combines. Multi-million-dollar machines sat idle at the worst possible time. The situation was reported with surprise, as if it were unprecedented. In Cass County, Illinois, Daniel Boak did not wait for parts. He knew where they were. Let me leave you with this. The next time someone laughs at what you've kept, at what you still know, at the old skill or the saved tool or the practiced method that everyone else has moved on from, remember Harlan Boak. Standing in the oil slick underneath a 15-year-old combine. Walking into his boneyard. Coming out with exactly what he needed. There is a kind of man who keeps things because he hasn't gotten around to throwing them away. And there is a kind of man who keeps things because he understands that the value of a thing cannot always be determined by the person who stopped needing it. Harlan Boak was the second kind of man. Be the second kind. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.